2 weeks ago, I put my hand in a bin. And that's because I wanted to retrieve an old Coke can, because we made some scenery out of bits and pieces and odds and ends in the old school way. Making this was really fun and I'm very happy with the result, but we do need to paint it. So in this video, that's what we're going to do. So before we start painting, let's just recap where the scenery is right now, because it's all fully built and it has been undercoated. I thoroughly sprayed it with a black spray to make sure it got into all the nooks and crannies, and then I lightly dusted it with a dark grey to add a bit of contrast and to bring out some of the detail. And we're really going to build upon this in this video. So when it comes to painting scenery, something to bear in mind is that it really is a background, almost framing device for your miniatures, which are the stars of the show. So generally it's a good idea to go for more sort of dour, drab colours, and that's what I'm going to be doing here. So we're going to look at lots of greys and silvers and things like that, which I'm going to make sure are quite dull. But even so, I thought it'd be nice to add a bit of colour on there on the tanks to make it look like they might be filled with some sort of hazardous material. And I think yellow will work here, but it's got to be a mustard yellow so it's not too dominant. So that's what I'm going to be going for. So my plan is to start just blocking the colours initially, just with those rough base coats, and then we can start going into detail further on, which means, first of all, I just need a sort of deep mustard yellow. I'm going to be using some darks and yellow for this, and to apply it, I'm just going to grab a large brush. I'm using a large dry brush from Citadel. I'm just going to get some of this ready, not worrying about thinning it down too much, and then I'm just going to start applying it onto these tanks. Now, because we have that black spray in the recesses, it's going to provide a lot of shading here, so we don't have to be too intricate in making sure this colour gets into all the nooks and crannies. So you can see I'm being quite rough in the application, and I'm not worrying about surrounding details either, because we'll clean up as we add further base coats. Having built up the yellow, the next thing I'm going to do is apply 2 more base coats onto the scenery, starting out with a silver for various mechanical bits and pieces. So here I'm going to use some Surcoat silver. This will be for things like pipes, control panels, all that sort of thing. And because these areas are quite large, I'm going to use a medium shade brush from Citadel to block this in, just switching to a finer brush where necessary around more complex details. And I am going to take care when I get close to that yellow. Now once that's done, I'm then going to move on to a dark grey. So I'm using Dungeonstone Grey, and this is going to be for the plinth and also the platform on the very top. But when it comes to that plinth, on the top surface of it, so not the bricks here, just the top, I want to add a little bit of texture. So what I'm going to do is sprinkle a little bit of sand into my paint on the palette, and then paint that on just to get that nice rough texture so it starts to show through. Now the paint's dry, we've got some nice texture on top of that plinth, and also all the main colours are now blocked in. So it's time to move on to the next phase, which is to get some shading in there, and for this I'm going to be using some wash. I'm going to be quite rough and ready with this one because what I want is a nice bit of variety of tone in there. So I'm going to be using 3 washes at the same time, and every now and then I'm going to add a dot of water into them too, just to thin them down and make them go a little bit further. Now the 3 washes I picked out are, first of all, a dark brown with some Battlewood wash, then a black with Oblivion black wash, then also a dark olive green with some Necrosis green wash. And the idea is to have all 3 of these ready to go at the same time. I'm going to start out with one of them, so the brown for example, and what we're going to do is use my medium shade brush to load up some of this and start applying it onto the scenery, into the texture. So looking for nooks and crannies here. I'm not too concerned about open flat spaces such as the sides of the tanks, but I am looking for any recesses I can find. Now what I'm going to do is just randomly switch to another colour as I go along here. So for example, I can jump over to the Necrosis green wash, grab some of that without even washing my brush and start applying that too. And I'm just going to let the colours mix freely as they will on the scenery as we go along to get a nice gradual variation of the different tones. Same with the black. Again, I can just grab some of that and paint that on too. And once it's in all the texture, I'm going to give it about 40 minutes to dry. That wash is now dry, so we've got lots of shading here and also some subtle hue variations, but at the same time it has splashed around quite a lot, in particular on the sides of those yellow tanks. So the next thing is going to be just to clean those up, and to do this, dry brushing is actually going to work very well. Now I'm going to go back to the original colour, which was dark sun yellow, and to do this I'm going to be using a medium dry brush from Citadel. I'm just going to set this up by getting a bit of paint on the brush, then work it into the bristles and removing the excess on some tissue paper. Then I'm going to start applying this in a soft rounded motion, and I'm aiming for the parts where the splash wash encounters the smooth yellow on the side of the tank. Basically by working away at it, what it's going to do is just create a bit of a gradient and help blend that shading into the rest of the yellow. Now in some cases a smaller brush will be necessary, but for most of it this brush will be absolutely fine. Now once that's done, I can then move on to a light bone colour. So now I've got some Vampire Fang, and this is also being dry brushed on, but in more of a downward motion this time to create some subtle highlights and also a few subtle streaks on the sides of those tanks too. Now that's done, I think the yellow's looking pretty good, and whilst some of that dry brushing did catch a few surrounding details, we can clean that up as we continue along. But for now, I think it's a good point where we should start putting some texture onto the surrounding ground of the scenery piece, so some sand basically, because soon we're going to be doing quite a lot more dry brushing, and we can dry brush that at the same time if we get the sand on there and the colour soaked into it now. So this means it's time to get some PVA glue and start to put it onto the surrounding base. Now I'm just going to put it directly onto the surrounding area and then use an old brush just to start pasting it around and getting it worked up to the actual scenery piece. Now when you're putting this much on, it will start drying out before you've gone all the way around. So what I like to do is try and work in roughly quarters or so. And it's a matter of putting the glue on there and then putting the scenery into an old box lid, and then we can start sprinkling some sand on top. Now my top tip here is not to go right up to the edges of where you put the glue, because if you do, you can get a bit of a ridge forming when you start moving on to the next section with the glue. So just go a short distance away from it and leave it, move back to the glue and carry on, and then sprinkle some more sand on once you've progressed a little bit further. Once that's done, we just need to let that glue dry, and here it is all ready to have some colour soaked in. Now what I want to do is make sure I base the surroundings here to match my gaming table, which is like a grassy plain. So that means here I want to go for some sort of brown, some sort of neutral brown, and for this sort of scale really any sort of brown would do, but what I want to use here is some dust bowl to make sure it all matches. So what we need is some of this onto the palette, and to soak it into the sand it's got to be heavily watered down, so I'm going to mix tons of water into this. And then all we've got to do is start painting it onto the sand. Just let it soak in, making sure it covers the whole area. Now this is probably going to be a little bit messy, so to protect the table, I am going to still be doing this inside that old box lid. And once that's done, I'm just going to give it a full hour to dry. Now the paint's dry in the sand, it'll really seal it down, so we can move on to dry brushing. And to begin with, I'm going to move on to Dungeonstone Grey, just for a dry brush on the plinth and also the top of the platform, on the very top of the scenery. To get this set up, I'm just getting some paint on the brush, working it into the bristles and removing the excess, and the goal here is to do a fairly heavy dry brush, so you can see I'm being quite rough in this to make sure it becomes the dominant colour. This is going to be for the plinth, but also the platform on top, where again I'm just making sure to be fairly heavy to make this the main colour up here. Then with that done, we'll do a lighter dry brush using a lighter grey. I'm using some Carcharadon Grey here, and the motion for this one is a little bit lighter, more of a flicking motion to pick out the texture. Then we can move on to the same sort of thing on the metal parts with a bright silver. Here I'm going for some Mythril Blade, and I'm just being very careful to avoid surrounding colours. And then finally, I'm going to use some Vampire Fang. And this is going to be across almost the entire thing to give it a light sort of dusty feel, to tie everything together. And this will also include the texture of the sand on the base. Now the dry brushing's done, you can see the scenery's gone through quite a dramatic transformation with everything starting to look like how it needs to be. So we can now move in for some smaller details, and really we're looking at a lot of details around the cogitator on the side of one of the pipes that's coming out the side of one of the tanks. Now for the screens, what I want to go for here is a dark green. So my plan is to start out with a base coat of a dark green, using some Wyvern Green here, which I'm going to be applying using a size 0 brush from Art Soaps for a bit of control. Now with that paint under control on the palette, it's just a matter of carefully blocking it in for that initial base coat. Now that's done, we can move on to a brighter green, start to give it a bit of a highlight. Here I'm using some emerald green, which I'm applying in a sort of L shape in the lower left corner of each screen. Take it further, I'm then moving on to a brighter green with some Talisman Green, and I'm just focusing a little bit more towards that corner. Finally, to finish it off, I'm going to add a specular highlight with a white, and here I'm using White Star as a dot in the opposite corner. Now that we've got that screen done, we can move downwards because this cogitator has a printout happening, so we need to paint the parchment here. For this, what I'll be doing is starting out with a base coat of some Dragon Fang, which again I'm going to be applying using that size 0 brush. We just want to block this in first of all. Once that's done, we can then apply a brown wash over the top. I'm using some Battlemud wash here to get some shading and definition. Now once that's dry, we can then layer the parchment to brighten it up before moving into highlighting. For this, I'm using some Skeleton Legion. And then finally, the highlight is going to be some Vampire Fang, and this is just going to be used to pick out all the sharpest end features that really stand out. With that, the Cogitator is now finished, so at this stage things are looking pretty good because all the main colours are now blocked in. We're really looking at painting in some weathering, then doing static grass and things around the edge of the base. But before that, I think it'd be a really good idea now to put some transfers onto the tanks because they're really large open spaces of yellow. I think we could do with breaking that up a little bit with some like large numbers and things like that. So I'm going to apply some transfers. I've gone through the collection and I found some cool ones, including the Baneblade transfer sheets. I'm going to use some bits from this and a few others. Then when we come back, we'll do some weathering. Now the transfers have been applied, I think it's really starting to come to life, and you can see the kind of thing I've gone for in that I put numbers on each of the tanks. So I've got 5 and 6 in Roman numerals. I've got some Aquillas on there and also some hazard markings, all that sort of thing. But I think what they need is a little bit of weathering now to start to blend them in with the surrounding paintwork to make them look a little bit older. So I'm going to start out by chipping into these. And to do this sort of thing, what you should do is use the same colour that's beneath your transfers. So in my case, that's going to be Dark Sun Yellow. What I'm going to do is get a little bit of this paint onto a bit of sponge that I've just turned up so it's a nice irregular shape on the end. And then you just dab away the excess of this paint onto your palette, just to get rid of the excess so it's not too much when you start applying it to the miniature. Because then what you do is start gently dabbing it on and around the transfers, and you can see it gets a random speckled pattern which starts to give the illusion that the paint of the transfer is chipping away. Now once you're happy with that, if you want to make any of these patches larger, you can certainly do so with a fine brush. Here I'm using a size 00 brush, still with Dark Sun Yellow, just to connect some of these areas and add a few more scratches. Now that's done, you can see there's an interesting illusion happening on those transfers and that suddenly they look like they're actually painted on and the paint's been chipping away over time. So we can take this a little bit further now by doing some more chipping into the yellow paint itself. For this we want to have some of what would be in universe the undercoat colour being revealed, and so going for a darker tone works very well for this. I'm going to use some Carcharadon Grey and I'm going to be sponging this on once again. So just like before, I've got a piece of sponge which I've rolled up. I'm just going to dab it in some of the paint, then gradually dab my way along my palette to remove the excess paint until there's not much left. Then I'm going to start dabbing this onto the tanks, looking for areas that would have a little bit more wear and tear, so corners and things, but a few dabs in some of the open spaces too. Once that's done, I'm back to the size 00 brush, and with this I'm just going to connect some of these scratches and make a few of them a little bit larger. Now the chipping's done, we're going to move on to adding some rust onto those tanks, and for this what we'll need is an orangey brown. So I'm going to use some Dryas Brown for this, and to apply it I'm going to go for a small brush because the idea is to thinly paint on some lines streaking down the tanks as if rainwater's collected and then run down the sides of it, generating some rust as it goes. So I'm going to get the paint heavily thinned down the palette so it's really quite runny, and then I'm just going to be careful in painting down vertical lines running from areas that could collect the moisture. So various little embellishments that might appear on the tanks, but also some of the larger chips that we've got in there too. And here we have it with those rusty streaks applied. And I did get a little bit carried away with some of this thinned down paint in some areas because I've also painted it into some recesses and other metal details to make them nice and rusty too, which I think looks really good. But it's not quite weathered enough just yet because really it needs darkening down towards the base of things because right now it looks a little bit too clean. So for this I'm just going to be using some wash and basically painting it towards the bottom of details. So it's going to be mostly around the bottom of the plinth, but also the pipes where they go into the ground, and I think on the tanks too as well, just to darken them down at the bottom. So to do this I'm going to be using 2 washes at the same time. I'm using Battlemud wash and Necrosis green wash, and like earlier when we were washing over the stone and things, I'm going to be using them both at the same time and jumping back and forth as I need to. What I'm going to do is pick one, so starting out with the brown wash for example, and I'm just going to start running this towards the bottom of the brickwork and pipes around the base where it meets the ground. I'm going to apply this over a small distance and then just quickly wash my brush, make sure it's damp with a bit of water, and use this just to smudge it towards the top so it fades into the upper part of the scenery. Now that's done, I'm going to add a little bit of toxic goo too, because I think we should have some of this coming out the pipe at the back. So I'm just going to run this into that and have it just spilling over the edge ever so slightly. Now that the goo is looking particularly disgusting, there's just one more thing to do to finish off the scenery, and that is to add some static grass and tufts to help blend it in with my gaming board. So what we're going to do for this is start out by putting the scenery back in that box lid to help catch any excess, and then I'm just going to get some PVA glue and start dotting some small amounts on the outside of the base. And then jumping back to that old brush, I'm just going to start stabbing this around, making sure it does go up to the edge of that base, but becomes more sporadic as we get closer to the structure. Once I've done this at about a quarter or so of that base, I'm going to start sprinkling some static grass over the top, just taking care not to go to the edges of where the glue goes up to, because if we do this, as we jump back to the glue for the next section, we'll avoid any ridges forming. Once the static grass has been applied all around the outside of that base, it's then just a matter of applying a few tufts just to break things up. So we started out from some scraps, some odds and ends, and of course some cans from the bin, but by just sticking them together, get some paint on there and a few little quick tips and tricks, as you can see it turns into a really cool piece of scenery. Something that's going to provide lots of character on the board and some tactical opportunities, because it will block line of sight, but also it provides a raised elevation for putting some troops on top of it, and you could even use it as an objective marker too. It's going to add a lot of character to a board and be different from anything else you might see out there. Now doing this kind of thing has been really fun, because when I was a kid this is the sort of thing I'd do to make scenery when I was playing at home, and I have lots of fond memories of making things like this with my dad. And nowadays it is a shame you don't see this quite so much, but I really hope this has inspired you to have a go. Remember, all you need to do is just keep an eye out when you're just going about daily life, and if you spot things that might be useful, if they're painted and stuck together in interesting ways, just pop them in a bits box, because at some point you want to dive in there and see what you can make. So I really hope this has inspired you. Have fun, and we'll see you again very soon.